Hello, and thanks for coming to this session 2 of the Bible series. I hope first session was helpful, as I do this one will be. We talked last time about what the Bible is, kind of very briefly, but none of that really matters if we don't actually read it. So why don't we read the Bible? I think there's a few reasons, and that's all we're going to talk about today, is why we don't actually read the Bible. If we believe it is God's words, which is what Christians believe, that means there's God's words who is speaking these words to us today. All these words he's speaking to us today, God's words to us. And all these words are being spoken to us in this moment and every moment. And as I said I was going to repeat, I will repeat today, every time that we open this up, God opens his mouth. Every time we open up the Bible, God opens his mouth. So, if you're a Christian, that means you follow God, that means you love him, that means you've surrendered your life to him. Imagine you're married and they come home after work and you tell them, I love you, just not when you talk. How long would that marriage last? Probably not very long. How do you think that'd go down, right? If someone was to say that to you, you would question their love, you would question their devotion. You would say, do you actually really love me? Because what you just said, and also how you act, doesn't really kind of seem to be that way. And we act the same way when we tell God to keep his mouth closed. So let's do a little bit less of that and discover reasons why we may not read the Bible as much as we'd like, or maybe read the Bible at all. So why don't we listen to God? Why don't we read the Bible? Well, the first question is more maybe scientific and historical. It has to do with issues with the text itself, with the actual text. One thing I hear most often is that the Bible, especially the New Testament, was written so far after real people and the events, it's basically just a way for a group to solidify power, like a religious group or a male-dominated way of living, or a group with certain morals that want to be preserved. It's basically like a power play. And they're like, okay guys, we don't have power, we need to get some more, so we're going to write this up to kind of solidify some of that power. And so some people might say, well, the Bible has some good stuff in it, but as one of my neighbors was telling me, you can go too far with that stuff. Some bits are okay. Jesus was maybe a good person, but that's not really, he's not really who the Bible portrays he is. Well, the first thing that we should do is look at the facts. I mean, that's a cultural thing that a lot of people believe by default, and it's not informed by facts. So let's not be the kind of people who kind of shun the experts because we think we know what's best. Let's see what the actual facts say. We should be willing to follow the evidence. And there are claims rooted in facts, and then there are claims that are just claims, and they're not really rooted in anything. Well, the first thing is that the New Testament documents were written early. They were actually written quite early. If we're going to look at the first 4 verses of Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, he writes this. He says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those whom from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, the most excellent Theophilus, he's writing for somebody, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. So Luke is an eyewitness to things, and he's searching after other eyewitnesses so that Theophilus and everyone else reading this book would have the certainty, so that we would know. Not just so that we can kind of make up our own ideas of what might happen, but so that we would actually know. And Luke, he's a doctor, right? He's writing this document. He's as much as it could be during that time. He's fact-orientated. And he also wrote the book of Acts, by the way, which is the very beginning of the church. He says it's based on eyewitnesses' accounts. It is carefully investigated. It's not just something that was jumped on by blind belief. He's writing an orderly account. This is like news reporting, journalism today. And Paul, in the same way, is writing about 15 to 20 years after Jesus. In the chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians, he writes about Jesus appearing to over 500 people, of which the readers could go investigate themselves and talk to these people. The whole reason why, one of the main reasons why names and places are used in the New Testament is so that people who heard these stories or read these stories could go back and talk to these people. Paul writes a letter to the church of Philippi, and in there he includes a quote from a hymn. Now that hymn existed even before Paul was writing, and that hymn was about praising Jesus for being God. So Christians were worshiping Jesus as God from the very beginning, and they were always happy and encourage people to look at the evidence, to not just jump onto something by blind belief. That's not how we're really told to live, but to look at the evidence. What do the facts say? There's another false claim out there that the Roman Emperor Constantine invented this idea of Jesus being God for political reasons, to solidify political power. But Constantine wasn't even born until 306. So much later after Jesus, hundreds of years after the Christian community was growing in number. In fact, the opposite is more likely, that Christianity was growing in such a number and was so quickly growing that Constantine had to back a winner. He had to kind of jump onto the thing that was already winning. And we don't have to really spend loads of time on how political types like to use religion for their own purposes, right? That has happened forever. So just because a political group might use the Bible or contort the Bible for things doesn't mean the Bible itself or Christianity itself is the issue. It could just be that people kind of do stupid things. Now, some people might think that the Bible is kind of more of just like a myth or a legend. And if it's like the stuff of legends, like, oh yeah, it's a good book, but it's kind of like, just a bunch of stories and myths. If the Bible was meant to have this legendary status, to consolidate power and present something as strong, it really does not do a good job of it. It's doing all the wrong things if that was the goal. If your goal was to create a powerful community, you would not include the fact that the leader of that community died, and not just died, but died a very shameful death. You wouldn't include that the leader, God no less, was asking the Father to remove the suffering of the cross in the Garden of Gethsemane. That's not something you would do if you wanted to solidify power. You wouldn't include Jesus' cry, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In this time that the Bible was written, you wouldn't rely on a woman's testimony because they weren't allowed in court, because that male-dominated cultures didn't see women's testimony as truthful. And yet, all the earliest witnesses to Jesus' resurrection were women. If you wanted to make up something, you'd never say that. What you'd want to do is cover those things up. And if you've ever read the Gospels, the disciples who would be like the winners on the end of that, if this is a power play kind of thing, they come across looking kind of dumb, not really knowing what's going on, and scared. That's not what you would write if you want this to be a powerful community. The apostles were not strong. They generally look stupid. They're weak. And then you just look through the Old Testament. The fathers of our faith in Genesis, Abraham and Noah, they are horrible people who do horrible things. Womanizers, connivers. David was a war criminal who takes advantage of women. This is not how you would create a legend to consolidate power for yourself. It's just not. What it might do is show on display, even through the brokenness of these people, God's purposes still get worked out. And there's a problem when you're talking about legends and myth, the problem of genre, the way something is written. Legends and myths have a way of being written. If I was to say once upon a time, you'd know all of a sudden, okay, this is not a real story. This is something kind of being made up. You know what's coming next. It's a fairy tale. It's not a hard-hitting news report. This isn't like investigative journalism. And this is true of our time. And each time and each culture has its own way of writing to kind of signal to the reader, this is the kind of information I'm writing about. In the time of the Bible, whether it's the New Testament or the Old Testament, the way the Bible is written is not how myths are written. Because we have myths and legends that are written during this time, and they're written very differently. And let's use that Luke 1 section as an example. That is not how you write a myth. I am writing this to you, O Theophilus, because I've done a lot of investigation and I've talking to the eyewitnesses. That's not how you begin a myth. And it's far too detailed. And as you read the accounts, there are names, there are places, there are very specific details. That's not how you write a myth as well. It's rooted in history. All of the kind of genealogies that we all like to skip over when we have to read those in the Bible, that, at the very least, shows how historically accurate and present this book is. It's not a novel. It's not a myth. The novel wasn't even a way of writing at the time, by the way. As one scholar put it, and I love this quote, either this is reporting history, like journalism, or else some unknown writer, without someone before him or after him, has anticipated the whole technique of novel, modern, realistic narrative. So what requires more faith? Either it's like the thing that it seems to be, or it's this kind of thing that we have no evidence of ever existing, before or after, until our modern day. Now, there's this other word that is helpful, and you get to wow your friends by using it in conversation. That's historicity. That's basically a way of putting historical authenticity into one word. Historicity. There you go. Wow your friends. What I'm going to put on the screen here is a table of ancient documents. Now, there's a common response in secular and Muslim situations that you can't trust the Bible because it's been tainted. The transmission of the Bible has been totally messed up, and we don't really know what the originals ever said. But the actual data shows that the Bible has the shortest time gap between events and writing and the highest level of copies. No historical document, none, is better attested than the Bible. Now, most people don't spend time going into the actual data, but it's actually really not that difficult to find. There's a lot of work that goes into it. It's difficult work going into it, but the findings are very easy to see. And whether you're a Christian or not a Christian, this is the evidence that's out there. And lastly, to use another big exciting word for all you nerds out there, it's intertextuality. I'll leave this as the last point. Intertextuality. Intertextuality, we talked about this briefly in the first session. It's how a document references itself. How connected a document is within itself. It's kind of like hyperlinks within its own kind of text. If it's coherent, there'll be a lot of connections of how it references itself. Does the end connect with the middle and the beginning and all that kind of stuff? You would expect over 60 authors over a span of 14 or 15 centuries, different cultural beliefs, different languages, different places, different backgrounds, you would expect very low intertextuality when all those documents are put together. But that's not what we get. What we get is a stunning example of high intertextuality. And here's that image again that we used from the first session. All those lines represent a cross-reference to another. And there's so many of them, it looks like just color fields. And those different colors represent the distance between the connections. And so we have all those kinds of things going on and on and on, all connected within each other. So we have issues with the text, and that's a real thing. We also have issues with our culture. This is probably a bit of a bigger deal for us. There are things that the Bible teaches that are out of sync with our current cultural situation. And that's something that every Christian from every time and every place, whether in the past or in the future, will have said or will be able to say. The Bible is always offensive to some people in some ways. And there are pressures that we get, though, from the surrounding culture that make reading and believing this very difficult. I completely get that. Everyone is in that. And that pressure, though, what it does often, it finds a way in us and kind of grabs certain parts of our hearts. And the parts of our hearts that are formed by culture and not by God, they're going to lash out. They're going to cry out in pain. They're like, no, that can't be. I don't like that. Let's find a way around that. Now, nobody likes that feeling, right? Nobody likes that. Sometimes when that feeling comes up, instead of fighting it, we legitimize it and we kind of acquiesce a bit. So what happens when that goes on is we put ourselves as judges over God's word. This is what's legit, this is what's not. That's an amazing amount of hubris when you think about it, that we know better. Really, it's ridiculous, but it's something that every one of us does. Michael Lewis, who was, actually he still is, he's an American journalist, he's an author. He wrote The Big Short, wrote Moneyball, maybe you've seen those films. He also wrote a book called The Premonition because he wanted to understand why it's so hard for us as humans to have a willingness to follow the evidence. A willingness to follow the evidence. And that's really how we should all come to the Bible. We may not understand it, and maybe we need to understand it better. Maybe it doesn't say the thing initially that we think it does. But should be that willingness to follow the evidence, to follow what God says about himself, about us, our world, how we ought to live. Now, here's an example of how one can read the Bible and not follow the evidence. A classic example is slavery in the American South. From the start of the country in America, in the United States of America, from 1776, slavery was commonplace back when we were under English rule. And slavery was commonplace, especially in the southern states. These same states had churches, had preachers. People read their Bible. They were good Christians. And yet this atrocity was perpetuated for over 100 years. And one of the ways this horrible practice persisted was because people contorted the Bible to fit their own cultural values. It can be a very damaging thing. One can easily be on what feels like the right side of our cultural moment, but the wrong side of God and His kingdom. There were arguments made from the Bible about why people should be slaves, reinforcing this idea that some people should have slaves. This argument, by the way, was not unique to the American South. It started in England, and that's where we got a lot of our information from, so it was here as well. We're all of us are guilty when it comes to this. Now, some people might respond to this, to the idea of using the Bible to contort it, to talk about human chattel slavery, things like that, and say, see, you can really make the Bible say anything. You can make the Bible say anything. It's all about how you interpret it. But most of those people haven't read the pro-slavery arguments or the Bible texts they refer to, because if you've ever actually read them, and if you want some grim reading, you can read them. When you read them, you see how ludicrous and weak and how just plain wrong the arguments are. And that's not just like looking back in history being like, oh, it's so clear to us now. The Bible, whether it was abolitionists or slave owners, the Bible was used for everybody for their own reason. The Bible actually probably didn't change very many people's minds anyway. Now, it's not that the Bible is saying this at all, that slavery is something that ought to happen. It's that we humans attempt to contort the Bible to say what we want to hear. And that is true for all of us. We humans attempt to contort the Bible to say what we want to hear because we want an easier life. Now, as horrible as the practice of American slavery was, and slavery throughout the empire, and how horrible for people identifying as Christians to perpetuate it, this is what we continue to do. When we read something that doesn't agree with our cultural climate, like with what's going on right now in our moment, what we do is we try and remove it, we contort it, make it say something else. Basically, we don't follow the evidence. Something like sexual ethics today. 100 years ago, there were other things that people cared about. 100 years from now, there'll be other things that people care about. And what we'll do, and what we will all be tempted to do, is contort it to make it fit the day. And that's because our need to belong often outweighs our search for the truth. We want to belong before we really kind of want to know reality. So the goal for us is to not be like the slave owners in the American South, to read the Bible and to follow what it says. And by the way, the beginning of the end of the slave trade in the UK was led by William Wilberforce. When he converted to Christianity is when he organized people in order to kind of undo the slave trade, which led to the abolition movement in America. So it all started with someone actually reading their Bible in a way that they actually applied. So let's do better than American slave owners, and let's follow what the Bible says. Now, often what we do when confronted with something that might initially offend us is to throw everything out. If we read this line and that's offensive, then we throw it all out and the whole thing is bad. We stop the whole process of learning. We stop the whole process of being curious, of asking questions, of talking to God about the problems that we have because we were offended by one specific spot. Don't let being offended lead you to miss out on God's words of life to you. You might have to live with that offense for a long time, maybe your entire life. But if you throw it all out, you're going to miss what God has to say for you, all the good stuff that God has to say to you. So there are issues that we talked about with the text. We talked about issues with our cultural situation. There are also issues within ourselves in that we just kind of don't want to read the Bible. That's one reason why Why don't we read the Bible? Because we just kind of don't want to do it. Maybe we're lazy. Maybe our lives are over busy and overstuffed with stuff. Sometimes it feels like a battle. And you know what? It is. It is a battle. That's not, the Bible calls itself, it's a spiritual battle. Don't be surprised that it's difficult to listen to the Lord. The Lord is bringing His light to shine in darkness. Don't be surprised that it's difficult to listen to the Lord of light in a world of darkness. Now, there are lots of questions in there that you can talk about with your group. And the main kind of three areas we talked about is three areas that kind of talk about why we don't read the Bible is issues we have with the text itself, issues we have with culture, and issues that we have with ourselves. And it would be great for us to talk about that because we do have issues with ourselves, and because Christianity is a community project, and we can't figure these things out by ourselves. So let's ask these questions and continue asking these questions and see how we can grow together. Thanks for the session. I'll see you in the next one.